Welcome, sons. You've made it to day one. Congratulations. I'm so excited. Today, we start our journey looking for the answer to two enormous questions. What exactly is the good way that God counsels us to look for? And what does it mean to be one of God's sons? Those two answers are intertwined. I want to start by looking at the world from the rooftop of my house because the story God's telling has a house in the center of it. And to briefly explain that, I want to describe to you how people lived in thought in the region around Israel over the span of 1,500 years when the Bible was written. It was called a patriarchal society, and this is absolutely crucial for our understanding of the story that we find ourselves in today. It's still a patriarchal society. So, in that time, families were really large, and while everyone had a job, all the resources were entrusted to one person, the oldest man in the family. And I know that almost sounds offensive to us now. You know, most of us live so independently in Western culture. But back then, the patriarch had a massive job. He was entrusted with the care of the entire family, his younger brothers and sisters, his sons, his daughters, their children, nieces, nephews, in-laws. And the resources that he was the steward of were used to keep everyone in the family safe and comfortable and provided for as best he could. And the eldest son was given a special blessing and a far bigger portion of the inheritance than the other children, because when the father passed, it became the duty of the eldest son to become the patriarch. This was normal and normally celebrated in families. That blessing was fought over, of course. Now, this context helps us understand a word critical to the story that we, everyone on the planet, find ourselves in. The word is redeem. We tend to think of redeeming coupons or redeeming movies where everything works out in the end. And if you've read the Bible, some of you'll know that the word redeem is used often. God tells us that he redeems nations and people from the pit, from slavery, from trouble. But what does it mean? Redeem is actually not a religious term, but it's a patriarchal term. Here's what it means. Everyone and everything under the care of the patriarch was said to live in the father's house, or in Hebrew, betab. And if ever anyone in the father's house was marginalized or compromised or lost or stolen or kidnapped, it was the patriarch, the father's job, to pay the necessary price and to go get them and to bring them back and restore them back to the father's house. That's redemption. But it actually went beyond that, beyond people. If family made poor decisions and lost property in betting or wild gambling, the patriarch would use his resources to restore that property back to the father's house. Stories like this are all through the Bible. And our story, the human story that we find ourselves living in today, is a bit like the Star Wars saga, actually. We're just one big, unhappy, dysfunctional family, and at times it gets really dramatic. But the root of all of this dysfunction that we know in the world is the fact that we don't trust the strength and the goodness of our Father enough to come home. That's my story. That's your story. And that's the story of every person that we can see from this rooftop for miles. God's sons and daughters are all in pain and in one way or another have been told that we can't trust God or that there is no God. We've all been deceived and we don't come home. But we are all in fact God's children because he says in his word that he actually knew us before he laid the foundations of the earth. He says that he actually fearfully and wonderfully knit every human being together in our mother's womb for a purpose. We're lost. We need a redeemer to come and to save us and to bring us back home. And so the Father, who has all the resources, sends his son Jesus to pay the high purchase price and then lead us all the way back home and fully restore us back into the Father's house. And, you know, that's my story. For years, I understood that Jesus had saved me. And, you know, I knew that Jesus paid a super high price. He brought me back home, but the reality was that I lived more like, you can see my backyard back there. Like, I refused to come into the Father's house because I just didn't think I was worthy. There was a portion of the redemptive story that I didn't believe in, I didn't trust in, I didn't understand. And so it's like I pitched a tent in the backyard, and I just decided, that's the best that I could do. And I kind of looked through the glass and compared myself, to God's sons and daughters that were inside. But the reality is, I just needed somebody to lead me inside. And boy, what a difference it makes once you begin to understand the full invitation of redemption and you start living inside the Father's house, sitting at the table where He feeds you, laying in a bed where you understand you're safe under the shelter of His roof, and where you get to receive His intimate counsel like a child would receive the intimate counsel of a loving father, morning, noon, and night. So that's one picture of the story that we're embarking on to help us understand how we become sons and what the good way is. Tomorrow, or the next day, I'm going to offer another, more poetic picture that God gives us. So we'll see you then.